She stopped mid-song, turned to face a man in the front row, and said nothing, because what she said next would either save her career or end it. The venue that night was packed so tightly that people were standing in the hallways, pressed against the walls, craning their necks just to catch a glimpse of the stage. Aretha Franklin was at the absolute height of her power. The woman who had rewritten what it meant to be a performer, who had taken pain and turned it into something that made strangers weep in their seats, was supposed to walk out, sing her songs, and leave the building $10,000 richer. That was the plan. That was always the plan. But somewhere between the opening number and what should have been a triumphant close, something happened that nobody in that room had prepared for. And the question that hung over everything that followed, the question that will stay with you through everything I'm about to tell you, is this: what does a woman do when the world hands her a choice between dignity and survival and tells her she can only pick one? To understand why that night mattered, you have to understand where Aretha Franklin came from. Not just geographically, though that matters too. You have to understand the specific weight she carried before she ever set foot on a professional stage. She was born in Memphis in 1942, and by the time she was a toddler, her family had moved to Detroit, where her father, C.L. Franklin, became one of the most celebrated Baptist preachers in the country. Reverend C.L. Franklin was not a quiet man. He was not a man who kept his feelings at a respectful volume. He thundered. He wept. He called heaven down into the room with him every single Sunday, and his congregation would be on their feet before he'd finished his second sentence. Aretha watched that. She absorbed it the way children absorb everything, through the skin, before the mind has words for it. She was singing in church before she understood what singing professionally meant. And she was extraordinary in a way that made adults go silent when she opened her mouth, the kind of silence that is the highest compliment, because it means your voice has overridden every thought in the room. But extraordinary doesn't protect you. It never has. Her mother left when Aretha was 6 years old. Barbara Franklin walked out the door and into a separate life, and 4 years later she was dead. Aretha was 10 years old when she lost her mother permanently, and she never fully talked about what that did to her. She talked around it. She sang through it. She let the music carry what words couldn't hold. People who knew her in those years said there was always something behind her eyes that looked older than it should have. A kind of knowing that came from surviving a grief most adults couldn't have processed. Her father remarried, and the house on Boston Boulevard became a gathering place for the luminaries of Black America. Mahalia Jackson came through that door. Dinah Washington came through that door. Sam Cooke, who would become one of the defining voices of his generation, sat at that kitchen table and sang with young Aretha like it was the most natural thing in the world, because in that house it was. She was surrounded by greatness before she knew to be intimidated by it. That mattered. It shaped the way she understood her own voice, not as something borrowed or lucky, but as something that belonged to a lineage, something that carried responsibility. She signed her first record deal at 18. Columbia Records, New York City, the biggest stage she had ever stepped onto. And for 6 years, almost nothing worked. This is the part of Aretha's story that people skip. They jump from the church prodigy to the queen of soul like the transformation was inevitable, like the woman who recorded Respect in 1967 was always going to become that woman. She wasn't. She spent 6 years recording for a label that didn't know what to do with her, that kept trying to smooth her down, shape her into something safer, something more palatable for white radio audiences. They put strings on everything. They buried her voice under arrangements that kept her gospel roots at arm's length, as though the raw fire in her was something to be managed rather than unleashed. The records sold modestly. The reviews were polite. And Aretha Franklin, who had grown up listening to Mahalia Jackson shake church walls to their foundations, sat in recording sessions and felt herself becoming smaller. She was 24 years old when she switched to Atlantic Records. She drove down to Muscle Shoals, Alabama, with producer Jerry Wexler, walked into a studio that was nothing like the slick New York environment she'd been working in, sat down at a piano, and within the first session recorded, "I Never Loved a Man the Way I Love You." The musicians in the room reportedly stopped playing between takes just to look at each other. Nobody said what they were all thinking, because there were no words adequate for what they had just heard. They just kept recording. That was 1967. Within months, Aretha Franklin had a #1 record. Within a year, she had become something larger than a recording artist. She had become a symbol. The late 1960s in America were not a quiet time to be a black woman with a public voice. The civil rights movement had cracked the country open, and what poured out was not all beautiful. There was hope, yes, and there was genuine courage that moved history. But there was also rage and backlash, and a particular kind of hostility directed at black performers who crossed certain invisible lines. Lines about who got to perform where. Lines about who got to be celebrated by whom. Lines about what kind of music was appropriate and what kind was threatening. Aretha crossed those lines every time she stepped on a stage, simply by being exactly who she was. By the early 1970s, she was the highest-paid performer in her field. She was also, by most accounts, one of the most emotionally guarded. She had learned early from her mother's absence, from 6 years of Columbia smoothing her down, from the specific loneliness of being deeply famous while still being deeply vulnerable, that letting people see too much was dangerous. She performed with her whole body, her whole voice, her whole history visible in every note. But off stage, she kept a wall up. Professional, controlled, watchful. She was watchful that night. The venue was in a city where she had performed before, but the energy in the room was wrong from the beginning. She felt it the moment she stepped backstage. The air had that particular quality, a kind of suppressed electricity, that performers who have worked long enough learn to read the way sailors read weather. It wasn't excitement. It was something older and less comfortable than excitement. Her band ran through their final preparations. Her backup singers, women who had worked with her long enough to know her moods from across a room, noticed that she was quieter than usual during the warm-up. Not nervous quiet, the other kind. The kind that means someone is paying very close attention. The show started the way her shows always started, with the audience already hers before she'd sung a full measure. That was the particular magic of Aretha Franklin live. She didn't warm up a crowd. She arrived, and the crowd was immediately, helplessly, completely hers. There was something in her physical presence, something in the way she settled behind the piano or stood at the microphone, that communicated absolute authority, not the aggressive authority of someone fighting to be respected. The quiet authority of someone who has never needed to fight for it in rooms where the right people were present. But tonight, not everyone in the room was the right people. Somewhere in the first several rows, a man had been drawing attention to himself since before the show began. The ushers had noticed. Her road manager had noticed. He was loud in the particular way that announces itself as a problem before it becomes one. The voice slightly too large for the space. The laugh slightly too long. The comments directed at the stage during setup that were just barely within the range of acceptable before tipping over into something that wasn't. Aretha noticed him during the third song. She didn't stop, not yet. She was a professional of the highest order, and professionals absorb small disruptions the way trees absorb wind, by being rooted deeply enough that the movement above the surface doesn't threaten the structure below. She kept singing. She kept playing. She gave the crowd everything they had come for. But her eyes had settled on that section of the front row, and they stayed there. The disruption escalated the way these things always escalate, gradually, and then suddenly. He had been making comments throughout the first portion of the show. Comments that the people seated near him could hear, that her musicians on stage could partially hear in the gaps between notes, that were aimed at Aretha in a way that was both personal and dismissive in the specific combination that is designed to diminish. It was not the language of someone expressing frustration. It was the language of someone who had decided, before he sat down, that this woman owed him something and was failing to deliver it. The language of entitlement performing itself in public. And then, during a quiet moment between songs, a moment when the audience was still, when the applause had faded and the next number hadn't started, and the room held that particular quality of collective breath, he said something loud enough that there was no longer any ambiguity about whether it had been heard. The musicians heard it, the people in the first 4 rows heard it, her backup singers heard it, and Aretha Franklin heard every single word. She stood at the microphone for a moment that her bassist would later describe as the longest 3 seconds he had experienced in 20 years of performing. Her hands were at her sides. Her face was completely still, not blank still. There is a difference. Blank is the absence of expression. Still is expression held at such precise control that it becomes its own statement. Then she did something nobody expected. She stepped back from the microphone. She turned to her pianist, said something too quietly for anyone to catch, and the music that had been about to begin did not begin. The band stayed where they were. The backup singers looked at each other. The audience, which had been drifting toward the next burst of applause, suddenly sharpened back into attention. Aretha walked to the front of the stage. Not quickly, deliberately. The way someone moves when they have already made their decision, and the only thing left is to execute it with complete clarity. She looked down into the front row, not at the crowd generally, at him specifically. And the audience followed her gaze because when Aretha Franklin looked at something, the room looked with her. It had always worked that way. That was the nature of her particular authority. The man who had been so loud met her eyes and went quiet for the first time all evening. She didn't raise her voice. That was the thing that people who were there would always remember first. She didn't shout. She didn't match his energy. She didn't perform anger for the back rows. She spoke in a voice that was controlled and clear and absolutely, devastatingly calm. She said she wasn't going to sing again until he apologized. Not until he left, not until security removed him, until he apologized. The room went so silent that someone in the back later said they could hear the ventilation system. What Aretha Franklin had just done was, professionally speaking, almost incomprehensible in its risk. You do not stop a show. You do not issue ultimatums to paying audience members. You do not put your name, your contract, your reputation, and your next booking in jeopardy over a confrontation with one man in the front row. The economics of live performance do not allow for it. The politics of being a black woman performer in that era absolutely did not allow for it. Every manager, every label executive, every industry voice that had ever whispered advice in her direction had communicated the same basic message in different words. Keep the show running. Don't make scenes. Be grateful. Be professional. Be smaller. She had just chosen to be exactly as large as she actually was. The man in the front row looked at the stage. He looked at the several thousand people now staring at him with the combined weight of an audience that has just been told, clearly and publicly, that he is the reason the music has stopped. There is a particular kind of social pressure that comes from being the obstacle between a crowd and the thing that crowd has come to experience. It is not subtle. It is not comfortable. It works at a very primitive level, the level at which human beings understand what it means to be held responsible by a group. He said nothing for what felt like an extended measure of time. His companion leaned toward him and said something. A man 2 seats away said something else. The people immediately around him had the specific expression of strangers who want it to be known, clearly, that they are not associated with the problem. Aretha stood at the front of the stage and waited. She did not tap her foot. She did not look away. She did not shift her weight or soften her expression or give any signal that she was open to negotiation. He apologized. Not graciously, not at length. But he said the word, loud enough to be heard by the people around him, and he said it in a direction that was unmistakably toward the stage. What happened next is what the people who were there talked about for years afterward. Not the confrontation itself, though the confrontation was extraordinary. What they talked about was what came after. Aretha turned back to her pianist. She said something. He nodded once. She stepped back to the microphone, and without any announcement, without any acknowledgement of what had just occurred, she began to sing. Not a new song, not a restart. She picked up the song she had been preparing to begin before she walked to the edge of the stage. She came in on exactly the right beat, as though the stoppage had been a planned rest, as though the 3 or 4 minutes during which she had forced a confrontation and extracted an apology from a man in front of thousands of people had been nothing more than a breath between phrases. The band came in with her without hesitation. They had been watching her face the entire time, reading her the way musicians who have worked together long enough learn to read each other, not through signals or words, but through the quality of attention, the set of the shoulders, the particular angle of readiness that communicates what comes next before it arrives. The sound that came out of Aretha Franklin in those first notes after the apology was unlike anything that had preceded it that evening. Her voice was already extraordinary. It had already moved the audience multiple times before the confrontation happened. But there is a particular quality to a voice that has just done something hard and chosen not to collapse under the weight of it. There is a kind of freedom that comes from the far side of a line you were afraid to cross, and it opens something in the body that careful professionalism keeps closed. The audience reacted before the first full phrase was finished. The applause that broke out was not the standard applause of a crowd responding to a familiar song. It was the applause of people who had just watched someone refuse to be made small, and who were now hearing that refusal translated directly into music. The two things were connected in a way that everyone in the room felt physically, in the chest, in the place where emotion registers before the mind catches up. People were on their feet within seconds. Not the polite standing of the encore, the reflexive rising that becomes habit at concerts. Real standing. The kind where people don't realize they've moved until they're already upright. Her backup singers, who had stood through the confrontation with expressions of careful professional neutrality, now sang with something that was audibly different from the first portion of the show. Not louder necessarily. Fuller. The way a sound becomes fuller when the people making it are no longer holding back the part of themselves that belongs to the moment rather than the set list. The man in the front row sat through the remainder of the show in silence. He did not leave. Several people near him later said they couldn't read his expression, whether he was angry or ashamed or simply stunned into stillness by what had occurred. But he sat there, and the music moved around him the way water moves around a stone, acknowledging the obstacle without being stopped by it. What Aretha Franklin did that night rippled outward in ways that she couldn't fully have predicted in the moment. Words spread the way words spread before digital amplification made it instantaneous, person to person, show to show, musician to musician. People who had been in the venue told people who hadn't. Road managers talked to road managers. Performers who heard the story secondhand carried it with them into their own venues, their own confrontations, their own moments of choice between dignity and the safer path. Some people in the industry were openly critical. The argument went that she had taken an unnecessary risk, that a more experienced handler of difficult situations would have found a quieter resolution, that putting your entire evening's revenue and your professional reputation on the line over one man's behavior was a kind of self-indulgence that performers with real business sense couldn't afford. These criticisms came mostly from people who had never stood at the front of a stage with a microphone in their hand and felt the specific weight of being expected to absorb an insult and transform it into entertainment for the people who witnessed it. They spoke from a distance that made it easy to recommend endurance. The people who were there that night understood something different. They understood that what Aretha Franklin had refused to do was perform gratitude for the opportunity to be humiliated. She had refused to let the economics of the situation override the basic human arithmetic of the moment. She had calculated, in those 3 silent seconds at the microphone, that her voice and her dignity were not 2 separate things, that they could not be split apart so that one could be offered up to keep the other safe. That calculation turned out to be correct. Because what the years following that night demonstrated was not that Aretha Franklin had damaged her reputation with a moment of uncontrolled anger. She had never been uncontrolled, not for a single second, but that she had defined, publicly and permanently, the terms on which she was willing to perform. And those terms included being treated as a human being by the people in the room. Other performers took note. Some spoke about it explicitly in interviews. Others simply adjusted their own approaches to similar situations, quietly and without attribution, in the way that people absorb lessons they don't fully realize they're learning. The road managers who told the story shaped how younger people in the industry thought about what was permissible to endure and what was not. The musicians who played on that stage that night carried the memory into every subsequent engagement, knowing now that there were people who drew lines and stood behind them. Her backing singers in later years pointed to that night as one of the defining moments of what it meant to work with Aretha Franklin. Not because it was typical, it wasn't. She was in most settings precisely calibrated and professional in the ways that decades of performing force a person to become, but because it revealed something true about her that the music had always suggested without quite stating directly. She knew what her voice was worth. Not in the commercial sense, though she understood that too with complete clarity. In the more fundamental sense, the sense in which worth is not assigned by the market or the audience or the label or the venue, but is inherent, pre-existing, non-negotiable. Her voice had grown in churches where the measure of a performance was not ticket sales, but the presence of something honest in the room, where the standard was not crowd approval but authenticity. That formation never left her. It was the root that held when everything above the surface moved. That is the thing about Aretha Franklin that makes the story of that night worth telling decades after it happened. Not that she confronted one difficult man in one crowded venue, but that she did it with such complete internal coherence that there was no gap between the woman who stood at the microphone and issued her ultimatum and the woman who stepped back to that same microphone and sang with her whole self once the condition was met. She was the same person throughout, That consistency, that refusal to fracture under pressure into a performing version and a private version and a strategic version, was her rarest quality. Greater than the voice, though the voice was extraordinary. Greater than the timing, though the timing was impeccable. Greater than the industry knowledge or the musical intelligence or the physical power of her delivery. She was the same all the way through. There is a version of this story that ends with a lesson about speaking up, about demanding respect, about refusing to be diminished. That version is not wrong, but it is incomplete, because the deeper thing, the thing that the people in that venue carried out with them into the parking lot, and the drive home and the conversations with people who hadn't been there, was not a lesson in self-assertion. It was a demonstration of what it looks like when a person's inner life and outer life are not at war with each other. Most of us move through the world managing the distance between who we are and what the situation requires us to appear to be. We are trained from childhood to read rooms, soften edges, calculate when speaking the truth is worth the cost and when it isn't. Aretha Franklin did this too. She was not naive, and she was not reckless, and she understood the industry she worked in with unsentimental precision. But on that particular night, in that particular room, she made a calculation that most people don't make, even when they have the power to make it. She decided that the cost of not speaking was higher than the cost of speaking. And then she spoke. And then she sang. Those two things in that order with that specific quality of unbroken continuity between them. That is what the room could not forget. That is what traveled outward beyond the walls of the venue and into the wider story of who Aretha Franklin was, and why her voice meant what it did to the people who heard it. A voice is only as large as the person behind it is willing to be. She was willing to be very large. She had always been willing, even when the industry was not ready, even when the rooms were not safe, even when the calculations said to make herself smaller. She never made herself smaller. If that kind of story stays with you, the kind where someone's quiet refusal changes the air in a room permanently, there are more of them here. The ones history half buried. The ones that deserve to be spoken aloud again. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one, because some of the most important moments ever to happen on a stage were witnessed by thousands of people and recorded by almost none of them. And the only way they survive is if someone keeps telling them. Aretha Franklin's voice filled every room she ever entered, but it was her silence on that one night that told the whole truth.